This section is food and drink. This is the sign for apple. Now practice the sign for apple. This is the sign for banana. Now practice the sign for banana. This is the sign for beans. Now practice the sign for beans. This is the sign for bread. Now practice the sign for bread. This is the sign for butter. Now practice the sign for butter. This is the sign for cake. Now practice the sign for cake. This is the sign for candy. Now practice the sign for candy. This is the sign for carrot. Now practice the sign for carrot. This is the sign for cereal. Now practice the sign for cereal. This is the sign for cheese. Now practice the sign for cheese. This is the sign for chocolate. Now practice the sign for chocolate. This is the sign for coffee. Now practice the sign for coffee. This is the sign for cookie. Now practice the sign for cookie. This is the sign for corn. Now practice the sign for corn. This is the sign for cracker. Now practice the sign for cracker. This is the sign for donut. Now practice the sign for donut. This is the sign for egg. Now practice the sign for egg. This is the sign for fish. Now practice the sign for fish. This is the sign for French fries. Now practice the sign for French fries. This is the sign for grapes. Now practice the sign for grapes. This is the sign for gum. Now practice the sign for gum. This is the sign for hamburger. Now practice the sign for hamburger. This is the sign for ice cream. Now practice the sign for ice cream. This is the sign for Jell-O. Now practice the sign for Jell-O. This is the sign for juice. Now practice the sign for juice. This is the sign for meat. Now practice the sign for meat. This is the sign for milk. Now practice the sign for milk. This is the sign for nuts. Now practice the sign for nuts. This is the sign for orange. Now practice the sign for orange. This is the sign for pizza. Now practice the sign for pizza. This is the sign for popcorn. Now practice the sign for popcorn. This is the sign for potato. Now practice the sign for potato. This is the sign for pumpkin. Now practice the sign for pumpkin. This is the sign for salt. Now practice the sign for salt. This is the sign for sandwich. Now practice the sign for sandwich. This is the sign for soda. Now practice the sign for soda. This is the sign for soup. Now practice the sign for soup. This is the sign for spaghetti. Now practice the sign for spaghetti. This is the sign for toast. Now practice the sign for toast. This is the sign for water. Now practice the sign for water.
This section is clothing. This is the sign for belt. Now practice the sign for belt. This is the sign for boot. Now practice the sign for boot. This is the sign for button. Now practice the sign for button. This is the sign for coat. Now practice the sign for coat. This is the sign for diaper. Now practice the sign for diaper. This is the sign for dress. Now practice the sign for dress. This is the sign for hat. Now practice the sign for hat. This is the sign for mittens. Now practice the sign for mittens. This is the sign for pants. Now practice the sign for pants. This is the sign for shirt. Now practice the sign for shirt. This is the sign for shoe. Now practice the sign for shoe. This is the sign for shorts. Now practice the sign for shorts. This is the sign for sock. Now practice the sign for sock.
This section is about small household items. This is the sign for basket. Now practice the sign for basket. This is the sign for bottle. Now practice the sign for bottle. This is the sign for box. Now practice the sign for box. This is the sign for bowl. Now practice the sign for bowl. This is the sign for comb. Now practice the sign for comb. This is the sign for cup. Now practice the sign for cup. This is the sign for fork. Now practice the sign for fork. This is the sign for garbage. Now practice the sign for garbage. This is the sign for glass. Now practice the sign for glass. This is the sign for key. Now practice the sign for key. This is the sign for knife. Now practice the sign for knife. This is the sign for light. Now practice the sign for light. This is the sign for medicine. Now practice the sign for medicine. This is the sign for money. Now practice the sign for money. This is the sign for napkin. Now practice the sign for napkin. This is the sign for paper. Now practice the sign for paper. This is the sign for picture. Now practice the sign for picture. This is the sign for plate. Now practice the sign for plate. This is the sign for purse. Now practice the sign for purse. This is the sign for radio. Now practice the sign for radio. This is the sign for scissors. Now practice the sign for scissors. This is the sign for soap. Now practice the sign for soap. This is the sign for spoon. Now practice the sign for spoon. This is the sign for tape. Now practice the sign for tape. This is the sign for telephone. Now practice the sign for telephone. This is the sign for toothbrush. Now practice the sign for toothbrush. This is the sign for toothpaste. Now practice the sign for toothpaste. This is the sign for towel. Now practice the sign for towel. This is the sign for blanket. Now practice the sign for blanket.